Hello and welcome to GED Live at PALS. Today's topic is GED science, and we will talk about important concepts in science you need to know for the GED science test. This is part 5. We will continue in the grand topic of ecosystems and ecology, focusing on biogeochemical cycles, or as you might know them as nutrient cycles. So we will discuss what are biogeochemical cycles in general, and specifically we will discuss the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. The phosphorus cycle is probably another important biogeochemical cycle, but I left this one out here because it is not as important as the other three, I think. All right, so what are biogeochemical cycles? Biogeochemical cycles is about the matter that makes up living organisms, the nutrients. And the matter is conserved and recycled. If you watched the last presentation, we already had this picture in the last presentation, which shows the flow of energy coming from the outside in the form of light energy from the sun. It flows through the ecosystem, through the biosphere, and eventually the energy leaves the system again in the form of heat. Now, the matter and the nutrients are limited on our planet. There is no matter coming from the outside that is added to our planet. Well, at least not in vast amounts. For sure, there might be meteorites or things like that impact the Earth, but again, this doesn't add a lot of matter. So the amount of matter that is available is limited, and the matter, especially when we think about living things, is constantly cycling around. The plants absorb nutrients from the soil, they're passed on to living organisms and passed on to living organisms. And yeah, we excrete, we take in substances, inorganic substances like water from our surrounding. So there's a lot of exchange of matter, of material with our surrounding. And looking at specific elements, we can track the way they take, the route they take through organisms, and as well through the non-living part of our environment, which will be the geochemical part of the cycling, basically. So the bio part of the cycling is about the cycling of these substances within food webs and ecosystems, and the geochemical part is where are these substances and how do they cycle when they are not in living things. The 5 most common elements that are associated with organic molecules and living things are carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. And yeah, as I already said, phosphorus, we will not have a look at that. And they take a variety of chemical forms and may exist for long periods in the atmosphere, on land, in water, or beneath the Earth's surface. So geological processes such as weathering, erosion, water drainage, and the subduction of the continental plates all play a role in this recycling of materials, because geology and chemistry have major roles in the study of this process. The recycling of inorganic matter between living organisms and their environment is called biogeochemical cycles or cycling. In the image, one more time, we can see the flow of energy in yellow and red, and in green we see the continuous recycling of the chemical nutrients. Okay, let's go to the first cycle, which is the water cycle. So we didn't mention water as one of the important elements in our previous slide. We said carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus. The reason why water is not mentioned is that water is a compound which is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. And yeah, most of the hydrogen naturally is probably bound in the form of water. So instead of looking at a hydrogen cycle or an oxygen cycle for a biologist, it makes more sense to look at the water cycle, although there is an oxygen cycle we could consider as well. So water is the basis of all living processes. Every living thing needs water to survive and for living processes to happen. Organisms on land need a supply of fresh water. This is why it's important to understand and investigate the water cycle, especially because although most of the Earth is made of water, we know that 70% of our planet is made of water, only 30% are land masses. 97.5% of that available water is in the form of salt water, and only 2.5% are in the form of fresh water. And on top of that, of these 2.5%, it's only 0.3% that are in lakes and rivers. More than 99% are locked up in glacier or permanent snow cover or in groundwater, soil moisture, swamps, and permafrost. Water cycling is thus extremely important to ecosystem dynamics. Water has a major influence on climate and on the environments of ecosystems. We have our general types of ecosystems, which we might discuss in another presentation, the so-called biomes. An example of a biome would be a desert or a rainforest or a temperate forest and things like that. And all these general types of ecosystems are usually based on two major factors. One is the annual temperature and temperature fluctuations in the region and the amount of rainfall. So water plays a very, very crucial role in the formation of an ecosystem, what kind of ecosystem we have. And there are various processes that occur during the cycling of water. With the water, it's mainly changes of state, phase changes. So we have evaporation or sublimation of water, which is evaporation, liquid water turning to water vapor, sublimation, ice, solid water turning directly to water vapor. We have condensation, precipitation, which is the formation of clouds in the atmosphere, and then the rainfall, precipitation. We have surface water flow, the flow and stream flow of rivers, and there is surface runoff and snow melt and stream flow, as we have mentioned. Here on the right side we can see the example of how water cycles in our biosphere. We can see, we can start maybe with the water in the atmosphere, which can undergo several processes. We can undergo desublimation or deposition, which means we have water in the atmosphere forming, getting frozen on the surface of glaciers. We have precipitation, rainfall, snowfall, getting either landlocked in ice sheets, glaciers, permanent snow, or just rainfall. We have water in runoffs getting into the ground through infiltration, forming groundwater, into eventually seeping into a large groundwater storage. Groundwater can come back to the surface through different processes, into lakes or rivers, or seeping into the ocean, which is the largest water store of all, and eventually water evaporates again from freshwater lakes or oceans, where it goes back into the atmosphere, where it condenses and precipitates. So our water cycle. Why it is important to understand the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is probably the most important to understand for the GED science test, especially because it links in a lot with human impacts on the environment. The carbon cycle is one of the cycles which humans have a large impact on and which we have changed over the past 100-150 years quite a bit. So carbon is present in all organic molecules. That's why it's very important. We are carbon-based life forms. Carbon is the element which forms the backbone of all the organic molecules. Carbon compounds contain especially high energy. This is important for two things. Organisms use carbohydrates as a form of energy store and energy source, in the form of glucose, starch, or glycogen, for example. And it is important in terms of the compounds derived from, or the energy derived from fossilized organisms, which humans use as fossil fuels. And over the past century, the demand for fossil fuels has risen, and therefore the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere increased, which is produced when fossil fuels are burned. And this increase in carbon dioxide has been associated with climate change and other disturbances of Earth's ecosystems, and is a major environmental concern worldwide by today. The reason why this is because the carbon cycle is most easily studied and understood as two interconnected cycles, or two subcycles. One of the two subcycles dealing with the rapid, very fast carbon exchange among living organisms and their surrounding. Again, in terms of geological timescales, molecules don't spend a very long time in the body of an organism, be it a plant, tree, or human, or another animal. Thinking of organisms' lifespans in terms of geological times, they are very short. Plus, we are constantly exchanging carbon from our body with the environment. Carbon that we take in doesn't stay in our body our whole life. Whenever we breathe out carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide was part of our body in some, and so it leaves our body again. So this is the very rapid and fast exchange of carbon. And then we have the other part, the other subcycle, which is the long-term cycling of carbon through geological processes. And that is the formation of fossil fuels, for example. And the formation of fossil fuels taking hundreds of millions of years and being stored for millions of years. And naturally, fossil fuels eventually will leak to the surface and enter the more rapid carbon cycle again. So we have a balance there of carbon being slowly taken out of the rapid cycle, entering the slow cycle and being stored away for millions of years, and some of the carbon naturally leaving the slow cycle and entering the rapid cycle again. Now, by digging, when looking for fossil fuels and then burning fossil fuels, we humans create an imbalance in the exchange between the rapid and slow cycle of carbon, or rapid and long-term cycle of carbon, and we accelerate the release of carbon from the long-term cycle into the rapid cycle, and by that increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the amount of carbon in the rapid cycle. So we can see the carbon cycle here on the right side. Again, this was just a very short summary on the carbon cycle. If you want to know more about this, you can check out our lessons. There is a lot more detailed explanation about the carbon cycle. So here we see the carbon cycle with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, one reservoir of carbon here. Carbon is taken out of the atmosphere by photosynthesis of organisms, absorbing carbon, storing carbon. This carbon can be transferred to other organisms. All organisms do respiration, which releases carbon dioxide again into the atmosphere. We have carbon getting stored in the soil and in the ocean in the form of carbon dioxide, and eventually carbon in the soil, getting fossilized, entering the long-term carbon cycle. And yeah, here we and some other steps. So if you want to know more, you can research yourself or watch the detailed lesson on the carbon cycle. The last cycle is the nitrogen cycle. And why is the nitrogen cycle important to understand for us? The reason for that is that nitrogen is a major component of organic molecules in living things, such as proteins and nucleic acids especially. And all cellular activities are driven by proteins. Enzymes, for example, that control all the chemical reactions in an organism are proteins. They need nitrogen to function. Nucleic acids are the building blocks of our DNA. So again, a very important molecule here, both requiring nitrogen. Another point why the nitrogen cycle is very important is that nitrogen is very often the limiting nutrient, which is necessary for growth in terrestrial ecosystems. The limiting nutrient is the nutrient of which an organism does not have enough of. So if you add more of it, it will grow faster. This is usually nitrogen. Can be water as well, but very often it is nitrogen that is the limiting nutrient. Although there are in our atmosphere, the air around us is 78% nitrogen, we would think, well, there should be enough nitrogen for all the organisms around. Why is it the limiting nutrient? The reason is that organisms, especially plants, which are the basis of our food chains and food webs, they are not able to absorb and make use of the atmospheric nitrogen. The chemical bond is too strong. Plants can't break the chemical bond in N2, which is a triple bond, very strong chemical bond. So we can't make use of the nitrogen in the atmosphere, and as organisms, as plants or animals, we can't just take the nitrogen and use it to build organic molecules. It doesn't work. So several steps involving different types of bacteria in the soil are needed here to change that as atmospheric nitrogen into organic nitrogen and make it available to plants, which then form the basis of food chains and distributing the organic nitrogen to other organisms. Organic nitrogen is especially important in the study of ecosystem dynamics, since many ecosystem processes such as primary production and decomposition are limited by the available nitrogen supply. So we see the nitrogen cycle here on the right. It's a bit chemical, a couple of chemical steps and different types of bacteria are involved, as we said. So the first process by which nitrogen gets into the soil is called nitrogen fixation, and this is done by nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil. First step is called ammonification. So these bacteria change nitrogen in the atmosphere to ammonium, which is NH4. Ammonium still can't really be used by plants, so we have another form of bacteria, which are the nitrifying bacteria, which is a two-step process of nitrification, where the ammonium is first changed into nitrites. Nitrite is NO2-, and then we have another form of nitrifying bacteria which changes the nitrites into nitrates. And nitrate is the form of nitrogen or organic nitrogen that we want. Nitrate can be absorbed and used by plants to build their amino acids and proteins, and then organisms like animals or other animals, consumers, feed on plants and get their nitrogen this way. When living things die, decomposers will break down the nitrogen compounds, the proteins, and excrete ammonium as a waste product, which can be used by nitrifying bacteria, again, recycle these nutrients back into nitrates. For sure, not only nitrogen goes from the atmosphere into the soil, there are as well bacteria which are denitrifying bacteria that change nitrates back into atmospheric nitrogen. There's a little special part about the cycle which I didn't talk about yet, which was at the very beginning. There are some plants, so-called legumes, which have special roots. Their roots have like small nodules which contain a symbiont bacteria that live inside these nodules, which are nitrogen fixing bacteria. So these plants with their symbiotic bacteria living inside these nodules are able to grow in soils which are very deprived or which lack nitrates, because they have their own little nitrogen or nitrate factories within their roots. So these legumes are often used by farmers as a form of as an organic way of fertilizing their fields, their soil, without using artificial fertilizer. So legumes can be grown on a field that has been in use for a couple of seasons and that is now deprived of nutrients and especially nitrates. Legumes are grown there, they're just left to grow and are then just cut down and mixed with the soil, so that nitrogen this way is added to the soil again. This is the nitrogen cycle. We can see nitrogen cycle especially important related to plant growth. Okay, these were the three nitrogen cycles that we discussed today. Again, if you want to know more about these topics, check out our free GED science course. There are a bit longer lessons. If you found this presentation helpful, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. It will allow us to reach more people like you that want to prepare for their GED science test. Until then, I wish you a wonderful day and see you next time.